Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video, and boy, do we have a fun one for you today. But before we get into today's topic, I did want to let you know, if you are new to the channel, or if you didn't already know for some reason, I do have other YouTube channels as well as 2 podcasts that are currently going, and the links are in the description of every one of my videos to all of those other places. So you can check those out, but specifically I want to talk about the podcast for a second, because I have stories of the Civil War and stories of the Great War. I also have YouTube video channels of the same names. But for example, yesterday, new podcast went up on stories of the Civil War that has to do with the Allegheny Arsenal explosion. It's an often forgotten part of the American Civil War history. It was an incident where on the very same day as the Battle of Antietam was fought, September 17th, 1862, an explosion happened just outside of Pittsburgh that killed 78 workers, most of them young girls and women. And they were there making ammunition and other items for the Union Army, and a series of just bad mistakes led to this explosion that killed a lot of people. So I go into details about that. Most of the podcast episodes are anywhere from 25 to 40 minutes long, so they're not that long. They're good for the morning commute if you want to listen to them, and you can check those out wherever you get your podcasts: Apple, Spotify, Amazon, all those different places. Try to do an episode a week on each of those channels. I'm trying to get better at doing that. I do have some scripts ready to go for some future episodes, but you can check those out at your leisure, or you can click on the link down in the description below to check out all of my video channels as well. Okay, for today's topic, you may have seen that I recently appeared in a Mr. Beat video on James Garfield, and I'm going to be in his video coming up about William McKinley as well. So yes, we are friends. Matt Beat and I come at the world from very different places. Our worldviews are different, our biases are different, our political leanings are very different, but he's a friend, and he's somebody I have a great deal of respect for, while also recognizing that his worldview and his biases cause him to see the modern world in a different way than I do, and that's okay. But I saw that Monsieur Z, who we've reacted to a few times on this channel before, has a new video out called Everything Mr. Beat Gets Wrong About History and Woodrow Wilson. Now, I know Matt did a recent video about Wilson, and I appear in that video as well, briefly, and we are going to react to that at some point. But Monsieur Z also had a video that we reacted to a while back called Why Woodrow Wilson Did Nothing Wrong. And it's one of those videos that well, you saw a side of me you don't normally get to see. I'm pretty sure at some point in that video, I may have hit myself over the head with a shoebox. I think that was the one. Anyway, this is going to be interesting, because while I agree with the basic premise that Matt does have biases, guess what? So does Monsieur Z, so do I, so does every other person who has ever lived. So let's dive into this. I'll put the link in the description so you can check it out without my commentary if you so desire. Let's dive in.
Hello audience, Mr. Z here with a live show today. We are doing a reaction to Mr. Beat's latest video on Woodrow Wilson. Now you might be saying, well, why? A friend notified me and said, hey, Mr. Z, Dean, he referenced you in this video, so alright, I'm gonna take a look and see what he had to say about it. Now,
so I guess what we're kind of doing here is a little reactception, because I'm reacting to a reaction. I didn't realize that's what he was doing. I thought he was just gonna like present it. I didn't know he was actually gonna watch it. Interesting.
Now, some of you might know, I'm a Woodrow Wilson defender. I'm not necessarily pro Woodrow Wilson. I don't necessarily like him. He's not like in my top presidents, I'd say. But he gets a lot of unnecessary hate.
Oh, it's quite necessary.
Mr. Beat's video, just going off the title right here, let me pull this up. Why does the internet hate Woodrow Wilson? So maybe he's coming around and he's being a little bit of a Wilson defender right now. Wilson is not as, you know, as monstrously, cartoonishly evil as the internet has seemingly made him out to be over the last few years.
Yeah, he kind of is, but no, I get his point.
You know, you can agree or disagree with a lot of his stances, but he's not, he doesn't rank anywhere near worst presidents overall. But enough about that. Let's get right into this video and see what Mr. Beat has to say.
I am not Woodrow Wilson, and thank goodness for that, because if I was, the internet would hate me. I'm Mr. Beat. And why
doubt about
does
that.
the internet seem to hate Woodrow Wilson?
Thomas Woodrow Wilson. If you've been around the channel very long at all,
I just gotta stop right here. Could have sworn Mr. Beat had something to do with this. If not him, then, you know, his crowd of, like, Cynical Historian, Alternate History Hub, those guys that he's tangentially, or not even tangentially, but, you know, relatively associated with.
very long at all, you know I hate his guts. I thought he was going to stop and say something about me there. Hate him enough that, hate's a strong word, I never met the man. He's my least favorite president.
Wilson!
That's
to
the
say
guy.
I despise the man is
Well, he didn't say anything about me. I don't know if that's good or bad.
quite an understatement.
That said, some have come rushing to his defense.
by the standards of his day, executed the duties of his office effectively and well enough in line with popular consensus, as well as followed
I
through
like this guy. Gotta check that guy out.
with the agendas of the progressive movement and the agendas of the presidents who preceded him.
And actual historians, you know. Not just people who make history videos.
Yeah, to be fair, people who make history videos are by definition historians. I get a little. I've ranted on this a few times before. I get a little frustrated with the gatekeeping that sometimes gets done over that title, historian. Look up the definition of historian. It's literally just anybody who learns about history and then devotes time to teaching history to other people. So if you have a YouTube video and you're teaching people about history, you are by definition a historian. Historian has nothing to do with how many books you've written, how many degrees that you have. Honestly, that's all irrelevant to me.
Like myself, have been much kinder to Wilson. For example, Wilson was still ranked the 13th best president overall, according to the most
That doesn't sound too far off. 13th best. I can see that.
recent C-SPAN Presidential Historians Survey. And every biography
And keep in mind that Woodrow Wilson himself was a historian. He, I believe, is our only president with an actual PhD. We've had other presidents that will have doctoral equivalents, like, you know, a Juris Doctor, you know, a law degree. But I think he's our only PhD president that I can think of off the top of my head.
come across about Wilson seems to think his accomplishments outweigh all the negative stuff about him.
Real quick, I'm adding this in after the fact, but what does it tell you that the actual historians and the actual biographies give you a fuller picture of who Wilson is?
It tells me that the actual historians, which, keep in mind, they're only polling a certain number of them, tend to be academics who tend to come at it from a very particular worldview and a very specific bias. Basically, by interviewing actual historians, you're getting one particular viewpoint. You know, you're not looking at people from other fields that might also be well educated on Woodrow Wilson, but come at it from a very particular perspective. And academic historians tend to be more progressive in their politics, tend to be more in line with someone like Woodrow Wilson, so they're going to overinflate his importance and his ranking compared to other presidents.
Meanwhile, the internet personalities are making this caricature of him.
No doubt one of the most polarizing presidents in American history.
Oh, yeah, I don't know about polarizing. I mean, what I've sort of come to the consensus of is that Wilson is almost a litmus test for somebody's knowledge of history. I think if you've garnered the majority of your information about Woodrow Wilson from podcasts, from YouTube videos, from memes, from Reddit, you're gonna hate Wilson because that's sort of the memey, trendy thing.
Well, guess what? I did not garner the majority of my information on Woodrow Wilson from those sources, and I still hate Wilson.
To do. If you've read the history books, he's not a bad guy.
All right, I'm going to try really hard not to hit myself over the head with a box today. I don't actually see any within reach, so I think we're safe there. Not a bad guy? Even if you think he was a decent president, not a bad guy? And I've read the history books. I've read probably more books on presidents than any other topic, with the exception of the American Civil War. Okay.
Maybe that's a little too generous of a statement. He's
Okay.
not a bad president.
All right. I'll give him credit. He backed off of that statement kudos for doing that.
But you read the history books, you read what his actual policy was, you read about what he's done, and you think about it. It's like, this doesn't seem like it's anything out of place for what was going on at the time.
As long as you were a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant.
Further normalized racial segregation. He attacked many civil...
It's a 35...
Do not, because I think the moment at which I beat myself over the head last time was when he said he was no more racist than anyone else at that time, and that is absolute 100% BS, and I will die on that hill.
Minute video, so I'll probably cover it again later on, but Wilson's own sentiments toward race, I don't think it's necessarily anything that was out of place for the time.
Yes, it was. That's why things that he did in his administration rolled back things that had been done by the previous administrations, by the likes of Grant and Harrison and Garfield and not Taft, but and Roosevelt and others. The things they had done to advance race relations, to be a more inclusive federal government. In some ways, there was a lot of work to do. The military was very much segregated. Lots of aspects were, but the federal government, black people could have jobs in the federal government, and Wilson rolled that back. He was more racist than the people who came before him.
You're talking about you're talking about the 1910s here. A lot of people will blame Wilson for segregating the federal government. What actually happened? Here's the thing: was this a piece of legislation that Wilson, had ordered Congress to put forward? Was this an executive order where he's like, "Yeah, segregate the federal government"? No. What had happened was Wilson appointed a bunch of Southern Democrats to his cabinet, and those Southern Democrats, within their own departments, independently.
Who was responsible for that? Excuse me. Who was responsible for that? Are we going to say that a president is not responsible for the decisions that are made by his appointees? Because none of the previous administrations had that problem. So he appoints people who segregate the federal government, and he backs that up. I got to stop here because we are not letting Wilson off the hook for this. All right, I want to read this from the Woodrow Wilson house in Washington, D.C. This is from their own website, okay? When Wilson won the presidency in 1912, Washington was home to a growing black middle class, with African Americans making up nearly a third of the city's population. Despite this progress, segregation and racial inequality shaped life in the nation's capital, right? So at that point in 1912, African Americans comprised at least 10% of federal employees, enabling many to pursue professional careers and support a network of educational and community institutions in D.C. So they're making some progress despite the time period that he's referring to, a time in which heavy segregation is still going on. Wilson's administration marked a turning point. As the first Southerner elected president since the Civil War, Wilson and the members of his cabinet, many of whom held segregationist views, permitted the introduction of racial segregation into federal agencies. This shift occurred amid a broader national context as segregation laws in the South were becoming more entrenched. So this is a key moment when you have an administration in position to stem the tide of what's happening in the South, or to embrace it, foster it, make it worse. According to historian, okay, because we're going to refer to the historians that he loves to talk about so much here, Eric Yellen, federal segregation under Wilson was not only about separating black and white employees, it also curtailed opportunities for black professional advancement, limiting their access to desirable positions despite their qualifications and success in civil service examinations. Although Wilson did not issue a formal order mandating segregation, he allowed his cabinet secretaries that he worked very closely with and could have asked for resignations if they weren't implementing policies that he was okay with, to implement these policies, rationalizing them as measures to reduce workplace tensions. I'm trying to get everybody to get along, so I'm going to let them do this. His stance drew sharp criticism from African-American leaders, including activist William Monroe Trotter, who confronted Wilson at the White House in 1914. He said, "We had appealed to you to undo this race segregation in accord with your duty as president and with your pre-election pledges to colored American voters. We stated that such segregation was a public humiliation and degradation and the entirely unmerited and far-reaching in its injurious effects." And so those end up making things worse, and we haven't even talked about some of the other stuff yet. But here's the other thing about that. When he meets with this guy in the White House, he basically tells him, don't ever come here again. He basically saw him as this uppity black man who had no business talking to the president that way. And he said, if your organization is ever going to have a hearing before this administration again, somebody else better do it. Like, he basically told him, how dare you question me? And that's how he was with everybody.
Started implementing segregation because that's what they practiced back home. Wilson did not tell them to do this. Wilson did not encourage them to do this. This is just something they did.
He did not encourage them to do this. Listen, this is your cabinet. Your cabinet is doing this. The buck stops here. You are 100% responsible for what your cabinet does. And by allowing them to do it and it going on throughout your entire administration, and then by your own actions while president, you are tacitly endorsing those policies.
Might say, well, Wilson not stopping them and not doing anything to, keep him from doing that was like tacit approval or something.
I literally just said that.
My response to that is, what about all the presidents that came afterwards? The Republican presidents that came afterwards? If this was
also 100% responsible for the decisions that are made and the fact that they didn't reverse all those policies.
Was really so deep an issue. If Wilson was especially racist for allowing this to go on, why didn't Harding do anything about it? Why didn't Coolidge do anything about it? Why didn't Hoover do anything about it? Why didn't FDR do anything about it? Now, you could say he should have intervened. He should have been proactive, and he should have been like, no, you can't implement segregation.
Because it already isn't implemented. So by not doing that, all you were doing was continuing the way things already were.
The first thing to cover is that would assume that he was a lot more, he was a lot more progressive for his time.
No. All he had to do was not be regressive in that way, right? Because that's already the policy of the federal government. 10% of the federal workforce is African American. Do nothing. You don't have to be progressive. Being progressive would be to move further in that direction. Do nothing. Just don't reverse it.
To advocate for that. And very few officials during this time did. For someone to advocate for that, they would have had to.
You didn't have to advocate for it. It was already happening. It already was in place. You just had to do nothing.
On the far left spectrum of activism for civil rights, which, Wilson wasn't. But he wasn't on the opposite end. He wasn't a segregationist. He was just sort of like a moderate who didn't really care so much about it. And you can't really blame Wilson for this any more than you can blame Taft or even Roosevelt for it. Yeah,
Taft didn't segregate the federal government. He was president before Wilson. So yeah, I can blame him more than I can blame Taft for it.
Roosevelt sat down in the White House with Booker T. Washington, but he received a lot of lashback for that. And then he tried to bury it and cover it up, and he never did anything like that again. All throughout the...
All right, so we are going to compare Theodore Roosevelt not having further meetings with African-American leaders in the White House with Woodrow Wilson's administration segregating the federal government. You seriously are trying to tell me those are the same thing?
Previous Republican administrations, notably under Taft, under Roosevelt, and under McKinley, you had the emergence, and this was even earlier but more at the state level, of the Lily White movement. People talk about a Southern strategy that emerged later on in the 60s, but there was a Southern strategy going on way back when, with the Republicans trying to court the Southern whites into their party, and the way they were doing.
That's not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing if you do it at the expense of African Americans.
Doing this is they were basically discarding the Southern blacks and just the black vote in general. So, what we should say happened under Wilson.
The Republicans were already not getting the Southern vote. They hadn't been since the Civil War.
Wilson's administration is not directly his fault. he didn't do anything to stop it, but neither did any of his predecessors.
His predecessors didn't do it. They didn't have to do anything to stop it because it wasn't happening during their administration. If it happened first under his, I honestly don't even understand where he's going with this. Like, how do you say, well, his predecessors didn't do anything to stop it either when it didn't happen during their administration?
In mind, the segregation that was happening throughout we could say throughout government in general, this was going on all throughout the Lily White movement at the state level.
10% at the state level, okay, but you're dealing with state governments, totally different issue. The president doesn't have power over the state governments.
And then Wilson's successors, the Republican successors, they didn't do anything to stop it either. Anyway, I think I took like a 5-6 minute detour, Justin. We're like 2 minutes into the video, but yeah, let's get right back into this.
Many civil liberties, and was arguably the most anti-freedom of speech president we've ever had.
I don't know about that.
He was an elitist.
He's certainly up there. I mean, you can't just say, I don't know about that. I mean, give us something. He's certainly up there when it comes to anti-freedom of speech presidents that we've ever had.
A sexist.
You're gonna call the dude who gave women the right to vote a
He did not give women the right to vote. The president has nothing to do with a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment, by the way, that both parties supported at that point. So I wouldn't call him, like, extremely sexist, but no, Wilson does not get credit for women getting the right to vote. If Theodore Roosevelt had won that election, it would have happened exactly the same.
Sexist. It's like, look, say what you will about women and the right to vote, but it's like, you're gonna call the guy who did that a sexist?
He didn't do it. He didn't do it.
Are you stupid?
Guy freaking believed in eugenics. And longtime viewers.
A lot of people during that period did.
All right, can we stop with the, there were other people who also supported eugenics, therefore it's okay that Wilson did. No. It's an abhorrent idea. And we're not talking about a situation where 90% of the American populace felt that way. So yeah, hey, Wilson was in the vast majority of the Americans. To say, well, he thought the same way that a few other people did, that doesn't make it okay.
Theodore Roosevelt did, William Howard Taft did. It was, again, you're talking about, you have to take...
I'd like to see the evidence that Theodore Roosevelt had the same views on eugenics that Woodrow Wilson did. All right, so here's one particular quote dealing with how Wilson felt about eugenics. He was, quote, intensely involved in legalizing the eugenics that called for the segregation, sterilization, and eradication of entire swaths of the population. And he says that Wilson's streak of selfish egotism, a self-regarding arrogance and smugness, masquerading as righteousness, which was always there and which grew with the exercise of power. Wilson, the good and great, was corrupted by power, and the more he had of it, the deeper the corruption bit, like acid in his soul. Whereas I was reading about the people who accuse Theodore Roosevelt of eugenics, and their focus is on the fact that he felt that white Europeans were... intellectually superior to people of other groups. So there's a big difference between advocating for and pushing for laws regarding segregation, sterilization, and eradication versus the viewpoint that this group of people is superior to that group of people. They're both bad, but let's not pretend they're the same thing.
Consideration, what was going on at the time? Was it a...
We've got to stop with this. He was no worse than anybody else at his time. Yes, he was.
Bad practice, yes. But back then, it was common thought for a lot of the progressive politicians. Wilson falls into that same camp.
The idea of certain groups being superior to others was common to progressives. I'll give him that. That's not what Wilson was advocating for. He went much, much further in his advocacy for that.
Does that excuse it? No, but to say Wilson is uniquely bad for this,
he is.
It's kind of absurd.
Thing that scientists once thought was impossible. Make a balanced video about Woodrow Wilson. Wish me luck.
I don't know about impossible, man. I did that a little while ago.
No, yours was not balanced. Yours was very biased toward Wilson. And like I said, we all have biases, and it's fine as long as we acknowledge it. Don't claim you were balanced, though. I'm not balanced in Wilson. I am definitely coming at this from a bias against Woodrow Wilson. So that's why I'm hoping between what he says and what I say, you can find where you are in the middle of all of that. Just don't pretend you're balanced.
Maybe not a while ago, like a year, 2 years ago. Time really flies. Nah, but I already did that, man. I wish you'd give me some credit for it. Maybe you will. Maybe you will. We still got a lot of your video to go.
He was kind of a crappy historian. His research was kind of meh. He relied way too much on secondary sources. He was all in on the lost cause mythology, or the narrative that the Confederacy fought the Civil War not to defend slavery, but for more honorable
Hold on.
purposes,
Characterization of Wilson's work as supporting the lost cause, I think, is a little bit of a stretch. He argues that there's more to the Civil War than just the slavery issue, which is true. But yeah, you know, he can be a little sympathetic to the South.
A little?
In his writing.
A little?
So you could argue that much. It doesn't delve too far into the realm of like, oh yeah, you know, the Confederacy seceded not because of slavery, it seceded for all these other reasons. No. Wilson acknowledges that slavery was a key issue. I could probably, if I can find a little snippet from his book, I'll put it right here up on screens for you guys to read as well.
a historian, man. You just gotta at least try not to be biased.
I don't know, man. Are you trying? Are you trying? I thought this was supposed to be a balanced analysis of Woodrow Wilson.
His writings reflect white supremacist views. In a popular textbook called History of the American People, which was used in school classrooms, I should add, he wrote, quote, "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation, until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan to protect the southern country." Yeah, he freaking praised the KKK in a school textbook.
Hold on. Praise the KKKs is also stretching that quite a bit. What you have right here, roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation. What he's describing here is motivation. Why the KKK popped up. Why it came into existence. There is no praise here. It's an acknowledgement of what the Ku Klux Klan was. When the Reconstruction happened, you had a lot of the Southerners who again felt like they were being occupied and attacked, create the KKK as a terrorist group to combat the Union, to combat the Reconstruction.
Named history as the result of great men, usually white men.
They weren't combating Reconstruction, they were combating freed blacks. They weren't I mean, to an extent, they were fighting against the carpetbaggers and the white Northern Republicans that came down, but that was not who they were targeting. Wait, what's he laughing about?
Destruction.
Named history as the result of great men, usually white men.
Okay, all right, Mr. Beat. What does he mean by that? What does he mean by that? Let's hear that clip again.
In a school textbook, his writings often framed history as the result of great men, usually white men.
Alright, so if we're talking about the history of the United States, a country that historically has been about 90% white, yeah, it's gonna be mostly white men who are sort of shaping the history of that, you know?
That's fair.
Like what? If the history was like 50...
But the country's 50% women, and the great people of this country, we don't say half of them were women. So your own argument kind of falls if we're talking about percentages, right?
50% about like African Americans and 50% about white Americans. It's like you'd have overrepresentation there.
Okay, but we don't have women. Same problem.
And he generally just wrote about everything in a judgy way. Still, his peers and colleagues...
It's like the pot calling the kettle black right here.
No, he's 100% right, though. We've never had a president in American history that was as condescending toward other people as he was. That basically viewed everyone else, including his own cabinet and the other people in government, as beneath him and people that had to be tolerated because he was so much better and so superior to all of them. I mean, that's even his... proponents will acknowledge that about Wilson.
Wrote about everything in a judgy way coming from,
United to nominate a wild card to be the state's governor. Sure, they liked Wilson's politics and the fact that he was a great speaker, but they liked more that they could easily influence him due to his perceived political inexperience. Boy, were they wrong. Wilson did win the election and promptly turned on the party bosses, asserting his independence while getting some love as a progressive reformer. I should note that at the time, New Jersey was widely known as a politically corrupt state. As governor, Wilson signed a bill removing political patronage from states' hiring practices. In other words, he brought a meritocracy to the state. He signed another bill that
That's a good thing. So you're just not going to say anything about the fact that he's pointing out positive things although you're playing it at like double speed, so I don't know how you're picking any of it up anyway. But you're going to say he's biased, but then you're not going to acknowledge the things that he just said that were positive about Wilson.
Bribery and vote buying in elections. He signed yet another bill that protected workers if they got injured on the job. He got direct primaries in the states for political party
He's just legit just ignoring all of this,
which weakened party bosses and gave ordinary voters more power. That said, all this was much in line with what other major progressive leaders around the country were doing. Also, there was that...
All right. Do you notice the thing that Mr. Beat does here? Whenever there's an opportunity to attack Woodrow Wilson for something that was a progressive trend or current...
I know where he's going here.
...of the time, it's exclusively Wilson's fault. Whenever it's an opportunity to praise Wilson, that was just in the progressive current at the time. Yeah,
and that's exactly what you're doing, but in the opposite way. Every time there's an opportunity to criticize Wilson, you're saying, well, but he was no different than anybody else at the time, even though he clearly was different than most progressives at the time on those things. So you're going to call him out for doing it, but ignore the fact that you're doing the exact same thing.
Wilson did that, but so did a lot of other progressives. Look, you have to be fair with it. It's like,
so do you.
Look, Wilson was a reformer, so were other progressives. Wilson was a eugenicist, so were most of the progressives.
Not in the same way, though. And that's the difference.
It's like, you got to take the good with the bad there. And you can either credit him for it, or you can recognize that, yeah, he was part of a bigger trend going on. But I think it's very disingenuous the way Mr. Beat is phrasing this and framing it, where he will give Wilson the bad credit, and then the good credit, it's dispersed to everybody. It's just not very sensible.
It's not sensible when you do it with the bad stuff either.
And it's not good history. The good stuff Wilson did, yeah, that was just something all progressives were doing. But hey, Wilson was a eugenicist. Don't look at the other progressives who were also supporting that. No, Wilson specifically. Wilson specifically was the evil eugenicist in a sea of people who opposed. No, that's not how it was.
He was also the president of the United States, and no other progressive president advocated for and had the same extreme views on eugenicists that he did.
From Roosevelt to Taft.
Roosevelt and Taft were not advocating for the extreme position on eugenics that Wilson was.
They backed it too.
Okay, so let's first talk about the racism. Wilson's cabinet was probably the most racist cabinet since before the Civil War.
Which also featured William Jennings Bryan,
who resigned from the cabinet over Wilson's policies.
In this picture. Yeah, where is William Jennings Bryan? He was in there.
Okay, so his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, was just kind of racist, but the rest of it...
Wilson's Attorney General, there he is. And hold on, wait, what?
Cabinet since before the Civil War. Okay, so his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, was just kind of racist.
Just kind of racist? Dude, I wouldn't consider William Jennings Bryan to be racist at all.
So this is an editorial that was written by William Jennings Bryan a few years after Woodrow Wilson left office, 1923. It was written in the New York Times. And it's him basically addressing the idea of white supremacy. And among other things, what he says in here is that he totally supports the idea that blacks should have equality before the law, but that white people should absolutely be the ones in charge of the government, and that he would never support black equality when it comes to any state in the Union, when it comes to decision-making and leadership and laws. He said that the northern states will act 100% in concert with what the South does in white supremacy. So yes, he was kind of racist.
I don't know, it's Mr. Beat, he's a liberal.
So yeah, despite resegregating the federal government and thus bringing Jim Crow laws to the federal government, Wilson signed a bunch of influential progressive era legislation.
Okay, again, it's what I said before. Wilson didn't do any of that. And again, not even all his cabinet members did. It was a handful of them, mainly the Southerners. And understand, again, it was an importation of that policy from the South. Because keep in mind, you had Republican politicians in charge of the presidency pretty much since the end of the Civil War. Yeah.
Okay, but I thought a second ago that you said he didn't do anything different than Taft and Roosevelt had done, who were Northern Republicans. So if you're saying, oh, well, yeah, it was new, it was different because he brought in Southerners, and this was the first time Southerners were in there. So therefore, it should be okay because, well, hey, we're from the South. That's what we do.
You had an interruption with Cleveland, but, other than that, it's
and he was a
all
Northern
been
Democrat.
Republicans. So now some Southerners get back into the office, and it's not like Wilson appointed them because he wanted segregationists in office. It's because, well, by that point in time, the majority of Democrats in the United States were from the South. Like, where else are you going to draw them from? William Jennings Bryan was, he was out in the plains or Midwest at the time. I forget what state he was running under. He had, I think, 1 or 2 New Yorkers in there. And, those guys were a lot more mild-mannered. But the Southerners, it's like the Southerners were the ones sort of bringing this practice from the South to the federal.
Are you telling me then that Woodrow Wilson was a really weak executive who couldn't control his own cabinet?
Government. Wilson didn't encourage them to do that. Wilson didn't tell them to do that. They just did it. Sure, Wilson didn't undo it, but neither did any of the administrations after until...
All of his defenses of the bad decisions made by Wilson are that, well, everybody else did it too.
Until, what was it, Harry Truman.
A bunch of influential progressive era legislation like the Revenue Act.
Truman specifically resegregated the military.
1913, which dramatically reduced tariffs which had previously protected big corporations at the expense of consumers. To make up for this lost revenue, the law put into place the first peacetime federal income tax in American history, thanks to the recently approved 16th Amendment. That same year, Wilson signed the
That happened under Taft, by the way.
Federal Reserve Act, which established the Federal Reserve System, aka the Fed, or the central bank.
What did he say happened under Taft?
Happened under Taft, by the way.
In American history, thanks to the recently approved 16th Amendment. That same year, Wilson signed the
That happened under Taft, by the way.
All right, so yes, the 16th Amendment, which made it legal to have an income tax. Understand that when these amendments get passed, the amendments themselves don't necessarily make laws. They just permit laws. So, for example, when we talk about the banning of the importation, manufacture, and distribution of alcohol under a constitutional amendment, prohibition, we call it. That in and of itself didn't ban those things, but it did allow for the passage of the Volstead Act, which banned those things. So the Volstead Act being repealed is what started permitting alcohol again, even before the repeal of the amendment itself. So with this 16th Amendment, yes, it was passed during the Taft administration, but again, presidents don't have any control over amendments. That's done by Congress and the states. But the law that put the first peacetime permanent federal income tax into place was passed in 1913 and signed by Woodrow Wilson as permitted by the 16th Amendment.
Federal Reserve Act, which established the Federal Reserve System, aka the Fed, or the central banking system of the United States, that, still exists today. It was one of the most significant and controversial financial reforms in American history.
That was set in motion by Theodore Roosevelt, by the way.
Controversial, the Federal Trade Commission Act, which created the FTC to prevent shady business practices. Wilson signed
that and it's 100% true, and I will acknowledge to him that many of these fiscal policies that we're talking about were things that would have been supported by someone like Theodore Roosevelt, who was very progressive on many of those same issues.
On September 26, 1914, and the Clayton Antitrust Act, which strengthened earlier antitrust laws and banned shady stuff like price discrimination and mergers that hurt competition. Wilson signed that one on
This was also sort of an this goes hand in hand with the whole, this is the bigger progressive trend.
Yeah.
Wilson did some good stuff insofar as cracking down on big business, but it was building on sort of what was laid down by Theodore Roosevelt in the past.
And Taft.
The same thing with the national park stuff. A lot of people...
he's 100% right on that, and I will acknowledge that. And I know there are many people, especially conservative folks, who tend to be very critical of Wilson and some of those things. And you can be critical or not, but I don't think those policies make Wilson any different than, say, someone like Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt, for that matter, in terms of progressive financial, fiscal, kind of policies. So I'm not gonna say those things make Wilson a terrible person. Even if you disagree with his policies, they're not unique to Wilson.
People think that was Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt reserved the lands. Wilson actually properly organized them into the National Park Service. So this is something where it's like, a lot of people like to give the credit to Theodore Roosevelt, and certainly he deserves credit for it. But both him and Wilson also that was like a collaborative effort, effectively.
October 15th, 1914. By that time, World War I was raging across Europe, terrifying the world. Wilson, recognizing that most Americans were deeply divided in their loyalties, declared neutrality, basically saying the United States wouldn't take sides in the war. Neutrality was pretty popular with the American public while the United States stayed out of what was going on.
And it's important to point out that had Theodore Roosevelt won the election of 1912, he would have been much more hawkish on getting involved in World War I. My issue with Woodrow Wilson is not his neutrality. It's how quickly he shifted from that neutrality the second he got elected to a second term.
Across the Atlantic Ocean, he couldn't escape what was happening south of his border, the Mexican Revolution. When Wilson was president, the relationship between the United States and Mexico was unsatisfactory. After Mexican authorities arrested American sailors, Wilson ordered the U.S. Navy to occupy Veracruz, which ultimately led to more than 300 Mexicans getting killed and big anti-American riots breaking out. After a revolutionary leader named Pancho Villa attacked New Mexico, killing 17 Americans, Wilson ordered more than 10,000 American troops into Mexico to capture him. They never did. Wilson would ultimately send nearly one...
Yeah, it's the Mexican Punitive Expedition, and it was kind of a precursor to American involvement in World War I in that it helped kind of lead to the Zimmerman telegram and Germany's policy on Mexico, and it, of course, gave us the rise of John J. Pershing, who's going to become the commander of the American Expeditionary Force.
100,000 soldiers to guard the American border with Mexico. Despite a growing number of Americans being against imperialism, they seemed to let the Mexico stuff slide.
There's a lot of lack in context here, and I'm guessing we're gonna be talking more about the interventions in Latin America here based on this map. You gotta understand that what was going on in Latin America as a whole, this predates Wilson. This happened under Taft, and this also happened under Theodore Roosevelt. I mean, you talk about the big stick policy, you talk about all the meddling that was happening in Latin America. It was an experimenting of policy. Of course, Theodore Roosevelt goes in there with the big stick policy, very militarily aggressive.
Yep.
Taft comes along and says, we don't have to be so militarily strong-handed with these countries. We're going to use dollar diplomacy. Wilson comes around and he says, we don't want to influence the Latin American countries at all. We want to be good neighbors for them effectively. Well, that was an idealism that didn't pan out, so what winds up happening, because understand that there was a lot of instability here that was threatening, well, Americans directly as well as American interests, because you had American...
I 100% agree with him on all of this. I know I've been super critical of him to this point in the video, but he's absolutely right on how he's kind of framing all of this, that Wilson came into what was already a pretty big mess in terms of our relations with Latin America and the aftermath of the Spanish-American War and what was going on. And Wilson tried some things that didn't necessarily work and then tried some other things that are kind of precursors to the modern American way of doing things in the 20th century.
Businesses propped up in a lot of these Latin American countries, and they were being attacked. So, of course, Wilson intervenes, restabilizes things, and, you know, people give him a lot of blame for it. This is just like a bigger issue that was transcending not just his presidency, but, you know, that whole early 1900s
That's
era.
fair.
More controversial was Wilson's invasion and occupation of Haiti in 1916, his invasion of the Dominican Republic that same year, and his bullying of Nicaragua in order to...
In the Dominican Republic, we had actually tried to purchase back during Grant's administration. Grant had a deal in place to purchase the Dominican Republic. And, you know, part of the idea was that it gave us, you know, a place in the Caribbean before you have Guantanamo Bay and Puerto Rico coming to the United States. Part of it was the possibility of the resettlement of freedmen there, which had been tried before and failed other places. But for a various host of reasons, he couldn't get congressional support for it.
Its sovereignty in favor of American interests. Yep, Wilson was the first regime change president.
First regime change president is crazy. How about we talk about, you know, going all the way back to McKinley? We can talk about Cuba, we can talk about the Philippines, we can talk about the Boxer Rebellion in China, we can talk about Nicaragua, we can talk about Honduras, we can talk about Panama.
He's right. He's right.
I feel like Mr. Beat doesn't even know what he's talking about here. He just wants to throw and hurl insults at Wilson.
Of course, Wilson did all this in the name of spreading American values, but...
No, it wasn't about spreading American values. It was about keeping the United States safe. You had a deeply unstable situation down in Latin America.
I would disagree with that. I think Wilson was pretty clear that he was about spreading American values. And even in the post-World War I world, he talked about self-determination, but he only wanted to offer that right of self-determination to certain kinds of countries.
And he tried to be good neighbors with them. He tried to sort of let them be and not intervene in their affairs. But what happened is you had the spillover of Mexico's...
He tried. He couldn't help himself. He just had to help them in other ways.
Revolution. It starts American towns start getting raided. Then you go deeper into actual Central America, well, Central America as it is. American businesses are being attacked, being taken over. Something's got to be done about that.
Make no mistake, he often used military force without declarations of war. Some did criticize Wilson for being imperialist, but many others were like, hey, at least we're staying out of Europe. Wilson was quite popular by 1916, so popular that he was able to pass more progressive laws, like the Federal Farm Loan Act, which made it easier for farmers to borrow money. And you want to know why else Wilson was popular during his Keating Owen Act, which banned child labor.
I wish you wouldn't watch this so fast. I can't even understand half of what Mr. Beat's saying.
Wilson was popular during his Adamson Act, which established an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. Only having to work 8 hours in one day, it was completely unheard of. Crazy times, man. Wilson ran for re-election, campaigning around the slogan.
So again, he's acknowledging there's Mr. Beat saying things that I think Mr. Beat would argue are positive things done by Wilson, but we're not giving him credit for that. So he's only calling out the stuff that he disagrees with.
Was out of war, actually scaring people into thinking that the Republicans would get the country in a war with both Germany and Mexico. Well, he won re-election, becoming the first Democrat to win 2 consecutive presidential elections since Andrew Jackson. He kept us out of war. That's cute. He kept us out of war. Did he? Oh my, how quickly things changed.
He did keep us out of war up until, his second term.
Until
things got a little worse. Hold on. Let's just see what he says.
At the beginning of Wilson's second term. First of all, by the end of 1916, the United States had become deeply connected to the Allied side of the war. We're talking mainly Britain, France, and Russia here. The United States had lent billions to the Allies. In January 1917, Germany had resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning it would sink all ships without warning headed to Allied ports, even American ones. This is a policy that had previously led to the sinking of the Lusitania, a British ship that had 128 Americans on board. In February, what became known as the Zimmermann telegram, a telegram intercepted sent as a secret message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico, asking Mexico to join Germany in a war against the United States from integrating Texas, Arizona, and Mexico back, outraged Americans. Now, supposedly, Wilson did not want to get involved in this war, but by early 1917, he thought the United States had no choice. Not only that, he saw entering the war as an opportunity to transform it into a moral mission. They weren't just going to defeat Germany.
And he just said there, among the parts that I could actually catch, was that he said Wilson kept the U.S. out of war, and supposedly he felt he had no choice by 1917 but to get in it. So he's kind of given Wilson the benefit of the doubt there that public sentiment had changed, and he just kind of went with it. Well, also, I'm not going to be that generous to Wilson. You campaigned in 1916. Your main campaign was he kept us out of war. And then just weeks, literally less than a month after you take office for your second term, you're pushing for a declaration of war. If your whole stance was you're about peace, you're keeping us out of war, then there was nothing that was changing in early 1917 that hadn't gone on during your first term. The Lusitania was all the way back in 1915, before the 1916 election, before that campaign. Yes, unrestricted submarine warfare started up again, but it had already been going on before. So nothing new was happening that you couldn't have still argued, I'm going to keep us out of war.
They were going to spread democracy. These beliefs that the United States had a moral responsibility to spread American values like democracy, free trade, and international cooperation around the world came to be known as Wilsonianism. That's a mouthful. On April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, famously saying, the world must be made safe for democracy. Congress...
Okay, so there's a bit to unpack here. So, yes, Wilson did not want to get us involved in the war. Wilson was the peace candidate, but you have to understand what led up to that situation. Germany had sunk, about 20 ships, killed hundreds of Americans. There were German...
But that happened earlier. Like I said, 1915, the Lusitania is one of the things we always point to as being one of the reasons the United States got involved in the war. That happened in 1915, not 1917.
Been terrorist attacks on U.S. soil in New Jersey and in New York.
Yeah.
Of course, there was attempting to get Mexico involved in the war, which realistically they couldn't do, but we already had a situation with Mexico being unstable. We didn't need them spreading that more aggressively across the border, and, But
to me, that's not the kind of thing you couldn't have found a resolution for. If it hadn't led you to war at that point, there was no reason that the Zimmermann telegram should have been a reason to go to war, except that it galvanized American support for going to war. That's what changed. It didn't change the circumstances of the war. It changed American perception, which then led him. If you are a strong leader and you feel that peace is the way, American perception changing shouldn't necessarily have been what pushed you over the edge.
Causing hostility with us. How many warnings can we give Germany before we say, all right, look, we just have to do something about this? And again, this is a matter of looking at Wilson and using him as a scapegoat. The American public, after all the damage that Germany had done to us, after all the provocations, the American public wanted war. The American public wanted retaliation. America's politicians wanted retaliation. And a lot of this, let's also look at this from Germany's perspective. Because, to be fair, Germany had the concern of, why is the U.S. only assisting the Entente? Why are they not?
And that's a great point. You're going to say, well, Germany was doing all this provocation on the United States. Well, yeah, the United States was materially aiding the Allies, the Entente, the British, the French, the Russians. We were materially aiding one side. We were not neutral in that war.
Being actually neutral. The United States, at the very beginning of the war, was conducting trade with both sides of the conflict. They were trying to be genuinely neutral. What happened is Britain blockaded us. They created a massive blockade.
And we could have used our... Because remember, at this point, the British are not the allies that they are today. We don't have the special relationship in 1914 that we have today. We could have very easily used our political and economic pressure on the British to say, listen, you need to open us up to trade with Germany. We are not taking sides. You can't blockade our ships. But we didn't do that. We were very clear on which side we were a part of from the beginning.
Well, look, you can trade with us or you can trade with no one. What are we going to do? Are we going to start a war with Britain? Are we going to... Are we just going to stop trading and thus cripple our economy? Are we just going to harm ourselves?
So what, to me, it sounds like he's advocating for is weakness on the part of Woodrow Wilson. And yes, again, I am biased against Woodrow Wilson. So hear everything I'm saying from that bias. I'm acknowledging that. If you're a real strong leader, you don't get goaded into declaring war because the public opinion is in favor of war. You don't go with what's easy and say, well, you know what? Better to trade with the British than not at all because they blockaded our trade with Germany. So we should just accept that blockade and just trade as long as we're still making money. I don't know. It just sounds, these are not things that, to me, make Woodrow Wilson look good.
Out of some type of moral obligation to be neutral. Or do we keep trading with Britain because we don't really have any other option?
We did have other options.
We were a powerful navy, of course, but Britain is the superpower of the time. Britain is the world power. They have the world's strongest navy. What are we really going to do? Here's the thing, too. Yeah, Britain caused some damage to us.
They have the world's strongest navy, but just because our navy's not as strong as theirs, but guess what? The United States Navy and the German Navy together would have whooped on Germany, or would have whooped on the British, because the German Navy was pretty darn close. In fact, I want to show you this. Here we go. So here's navies in 1914. Dreadnoughts available, dreadnoughts being built. So you see dreadnoughts are the battleships of the day, right? 22 for Britain, 15 for Germany. USA's got 10. So more being built there, obviously. Pre-dreadnoughts, these are the older battleships that are kind of outclassed at this point. 40, 22, 23. Armored cruisers, 34, 8, 19 for France, 12 for the U.S. Protected cruisers and so on and so forth. Destroyers, 221, 90, 50. So, yeah, the British had the largest navy, but when we start talking about big ships, dreadnoughts, U.S. and Germany together, while neither one on their own is powerful enough to do anything, it's a deterrent for the British. The British couldn't stand to have the threat of the United States on the wrong side. And let's be honest about it. In 1914, German Americans make up the largest single group of immigrants to the United States. There's a strong German American population who would have gladly seen the United States side with Germany in that war.
But they weren't killing Americans the same way the Germans were. So again...
And the Germans were running ads in newspapers in New York City saying, listen, these certain ships that are entering the exclusion zone, that are carrying munitions like the Lusitania clearly was carrying weapons of war and things for the material war effort. Don't get on ships like that because we might sink them. They were doing everything they could to warn us.
Whose side are we going to take? I don't think it was right for Britain to do that. In fact, I think that should have sabotaged the American-British alliance and relationship moving forward into the future. Like, they acted in bad faith and tried to manipulate us. But, given the situation of the
I don't blame the British for doing that either, because, they were doing what they felt was in their best self-interest, and that's what all countries were doing.
Who are you going to side with, the British or the Germans?
Neither.
So, yeah,
neither.
That's
one
one
the
aspect
point.
Of it.
He kept us out of war means you don't side with either.
Then there's this aspect of it of being a moral crusade. The world must be made safe for democracy is taken out of context. When Wilson is talking about this, the democracy he's talking about is the United States. He's saying the world must be made safe for us. We tried to be neutral. We tried to just conduct trade
not
with
what
both
he was
sides.
saying.
We were pressured by the British, and then
if you look at what happens after the war's over and the way he advocates for self-determination for these European nations and things like that, he was not saying the world must be safe for American democracy in the United States. He was talking about democracy everywhere.
the Germans started killing our people. This can no longer stand. We have to have procedures in place so that
most of the people they had killed, they killed before the 1916 election, not after.
This never happens, so that we don't get dragged into a future war. And then people will say that the 14 points were Wilson's Here's the thing. Wilsonianism as an ideology is just... the name is terrible. Because Wilson himself was not a Wilsonian. Wilsonianism is something that was coined and, came to vogue well after his time. It does not align with what Wilson actually believed and with what Wilson actually desired with his 14 points peace plan. The idea was, more than anything, to be able to mediate peace before the conflict broke out. To be able to sit down and be like, look, we don't want any part of this. We'll help you resolve the tension and dispute, but afterwards, if you guys do end up fighting, don't involve us. It's not
Except we were just involved.
It's not our problem.
Overwhelmingly approved. Wilson oversaw a huge mobilization of troops. He created agencies like the War Industries Board and Food Administration. Wilson signed a law creating the selective service system after the Army failed to recruit enough soldiers. This caused the first American military draft since the Civil War. In Peru, all American men aged 21 to 30 had to enlist to fight for a period of 12 months, whether they wanted to or not. The selective service would draft more than 2.8 million men. Contrary to what you might think, the country's entry into World War I was pretty dang controversial. Many Americans began protesting.
Yeah, and to be fair to Wilson on the draft, pretty much every other country did the same thing. I mean, the British had a draft, the Germans had a draft, the Russians had a draft.
And Wilson anticipated this backlash. He promoted propaganda to sway public opinion, promoting the idea that it was patriotic to support the war. Yeah, that's when he saw posters like that, in order to create a chilling effect and basically scare the crap out of anyone, even remote.
And again, in defense of Wilson, he wasn't doing anything with the propaganda stuff and the creation of a government agency for propaganda that other countries weren't also doing. And I guess I'm sounding a little like him in that, right? Like that everybody did it, but I don't necessarily see those kinds of things as evidence that Wilson was bad. And I don't know that Mr. Beat's claiming that.
Criticizing the war effort, Wilson signed two of the most hated laws in American history, the Espionage Act and the Sedition
These,
Act.
on the other hand,
Act made it a crime to interfere with military operations, particularly the draft or military recruitment. The Sedition Act, which was even worse, in my opinion, made it a crime to talk trash about the war. Wait a second, doesn't that go against the First Amendment? Breaking both laws could get you up to 20 years in prison. Holy crap. And yeah, the Wilson administration arrested thousands of Americans for breaking these laws, including prominent folks like Eugene Debs, who got a sentence of 10 years in prison for giving a speech that criticized the war and praised folks resisting the war. He later...
Think about that for a second. A guy got 10 years in prison for giving a speech criticizing the American involvement in the war. That cannot be defended. That cannot be defended. And I'll be curious to hear if Monsieur Z is going to criticize that at all, or if he's just going to let that slide.
President from prison, and I'm not even done yet. Wilson also essentially ran a nationwide spy program for people to rat out fellow citizens resisting the war effort. He authorized his Justice Department to spy on critics of the war, especially those who lean to the left politically, and immigrants. It's always freaking immigrants who get blamed for stuff.
Maybe that this is a whole other discussion to get into, but you have to understand that when the country is at war, wartime measures are important to be taken up for this.
Wartime measures, yes, but arresting people for criticizing the war? No, that is not a necessary wartime measure. How do I know that? Because it happened during other wars and we didn't round people up for it. We didn't round up, I mean, you could argue, well, yeah, we kind of did, I mean, in some cases, in later wars, but guess what? People protest during war, and it's okay if they do that, and we have to allow that. We have to allow that kind of dissent, as long as it's vocal protest and not, supporting subversion and acts of sabotage and those kinds of things. That's a different thing altogether.
Security of the country. Mr. Beat, I don't think you at all would be critical of the wartime measures that Lincoln took up when the country was at war. Suspending habeas corpus What was it? That one fella, this politician from Ohio, if memory serves,
Vallandigham,
that Lincoln actually had deported to the Confederacy for criticizing the war. Yeah,
it wasn't the whole Vallandigham thing. Listen, he was not the only Democrat criticizing the war. There were plenty of Democrats, including ones in Congress, that were criticizing the war. The issue with Vallandigham wasn't simply criticism of the war. It was actually acts of subverting the ability of the government to prosecute the war. He was actively undermining the government. He wasn't just speaking against it. Totally different thing. That's why Vallandigham is unique, even though there were plenty of other Democrats that were doing similar, that were saying things that he was saying.
I feel like you would not be critical of that. Understand that whenever a war happens, when the United States is in a serious state of war, the government is going to take emergency measures to make sure that our security here, our national security, is not compromised and we're able to win the conflict.
I agree with that, but you can't just round people up for speaking out against it.
And keep our people safe. That should be, that should just sort of be a given. As for the immigrant thing of the time, you have to understand that at the time, a lot of immigrants coming to the United States were bringing over anarchist philosophy, they were committing terrorist attacks. Yeah, and especially people on the left. You had the emergence.
This sounds very familiar. They're all criminals. They're all coming here to commit criminal acts.
Of anarchists and socialists, and they also were engaging in a lot of terror attacks and, riots and stuff. Yeah, you can't really be too critical of that. It was sort of needed for the period.
He even had the post office not deliver mail that was critical of the government. Big time movements. By the time American troops actually got to Europe to fight in the war...
Just not going to comment on that, the post office not delivering mail that was critical of the government.
The war was winding down. On
Censorship.
January 8, 1918, Wilson announced to Congress his blueprint for a post-war peace that became a big part of his legacy. The 14 points. Yes, there they are. I'm not going to read all of them. We don't have time for that. But it included stuff like reducing weapon supplies, free and fair trade, avoiding future...
So he said that the 14 points weren't really about the war. They were all about future conflicts. But read this. I mean, we're talking about evacuation of French territory, evacuation of Russian territory, evacuation and restoration of Belgium. This is all stuff that directly relates to what was going on at that point. Independence of Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, relinquishment of Turkish control over non-Turkish populations,
wars for diplomacy, not wars, and self-determination.
Erection of an independent Polish state.
The people around the world should have their own say regarding who governs them. His 14 points also included his arguably most important and lasting idea, an international organization in which countries around the world could all resolve
League of
disputes
Nations.
peacefully, what we now call the League of Nations. Meanwhile, after years of ignoring protests in front of the White House calling for the rights for women to vote, Wilson finally gave lukewarm support to the idea, and the 19th Amendment would pass by the end of his term. And speaking of gay.
And this is him being just dismissive of stuff. It's like, if this was any other figure, Mr. Beat would just be lapping this up, praising it. But no, because it's Wilson, he doesn't give him the credit.
No, what he said was, it wasn't until 1918 that Woodrow Wilson finally spoke in favor of women's suffrage. He wasn't this advocate that was out there campaigning on the issue, that was out there at the forefront pushing for this. Listen, again, this is from crusadeforthevote.org on Wilson. It says, beginning in January 1917, suffragists picketed outside the White House day and night. They held signs and demanded their rights. Well, let's back up a little bit first. Wilson had many foreign and domestic issues to take on. The Republican Party had been split for the election, and Wilson was able to hide behind the Democratic platform. So he ignored suffrage during his first time. He did vote yes to women's suffrage in the New Jersey state election in October of 1915. Wilson announced only days before, on October 6th, that he planned on voting for it, saying, "I believe the time has come to extend the privilege and responsibility to the women of the state, but I shall vote only upon my private conviction. I believe that it should be settled by the state and not by the national government." And then, skipping ahead, it was not until his speech before Congress in 1918 that Wilson finally publicly endorsed women's suffrage by the federal government. It was believed that women's roles in World War I helped Wilson see the need for suffrage. So Mr. Beat's accurate in saying that Wilson finally came around and spoke on the topic in 1918. That's 100% accurate.
That's the one banning alcohol? He vetoed its enforcement, but Congress overrode his veto. After the war officially ended at the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of the year, Wilson, just straight up left the United States for 6 months to hang out in Paris, where he became a big-time influential member of the peace talks. He became the first American president to travel to Europe while in office. Edith would join him.
And he legit just lived over there for a while because and honestly, I think this was a big motivation for Wilson getting involved in the war in the first place. He wanted a seat at the peace talks. And that wasn't unusual. Japan got involved for the same reason. Italy got involved because of what they thought they'd get out of a post-war settlement. There were many nations that got involved for those kinds of motivations. But he saw this as, this is my opportunity on the world stage to have my way.
First, what resulted was the infamous Treaty of Versailles. Wilson got the League of Nations into the treaty, but unfortunately, the treaty also severely punished Germany, which, wouldn't you know it, set up the stage for World War II.
That wasn't Wilson's fault. That was primarily Britain and France.
I agree.
Wilson specifically told them, do not seek retaliation against Germany.
He's right, and I will agree with him in defending Wilson on that.
Have a peace where everything is nice and even, and there's no harsh feelings between the countries. France and Britain, who were actually involved for the majority of the war and felt that they had more say, said no. We're going to punish Germany. We're going to give them punitive measures, and they're never going to rise up again. Wilson, you might say, well, why didn't he fight back against this? What leverage did he have? Heck, Again,
what I keep hearing over and over again is there was nothing Wilson can do. I mean, we're painting him as this weak, ineffectual leader. He couldn't control his own cabinet. They were going to do what they wanted. Whatever, He couldn't control the fact that the U.S. got into the war. People wanted it, so what was he going to do? He couldn't find a peaceful solution in the Caribbean and Latin America, so he had to send troops. What was he going to do? He couldn't do anything about Britain and France doing that. What choice did he have?
Even Congress wasn't backing his peace plan. What leverage did he have to argue in favor otherwise?
Less than 20 years later, when Wilson finally returned to the United States, it was kind of...
I hate this narrative too. This narrative from the left that Wilson's to blame for the rise of Nazism in Germany, and
He's not.
From the right that Wilson's to blame for the rise of communism in Russia. It's based on nothing. It's insanity. It's just totally made up. I don't know. Let's keep going.
Lynchings of African Americans had dramatically been on the rise, and the federal government had done little to stop it. A series of race riots in the summer of 1919 led to the deaths of hundreds of innocent African Americans and the destruction of their private property. By that time, the first Red Scare was in full swing, a period of extreme paranoia and hatred of not just communism, but anyone who had non-mainstream left-leaning political views. This fear led to Wilson's new Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, arresting and deporting all kinds of random people, known as the Palmer Raids. He'd end up overseeing...
Not random people. These are people who... let's pull up the details. In 1919, a series of mail bombs targeted prominent figures, businessmen, judges, and government officials. In June, Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer's own house was bombed by an Italian anarchist. And, before Mr. Beats Mr. Z, being anti-immigrant, yeah, I'm Italian myself, so get off my back. No one was killed except the bomber himself, but the explosion destroyed the front of Palmer's home in D.C., nearly killed his family. This personal attack radicalized Palmer. He became convinced there was a coordinated anarchist plot to overthrow the government. Alright, so just to be clear, the Wall Street bombing tied to the exact same anarchist network that spurred on the Palmer raids. Horse-drawn wagon was packed with 100 pounds of dynamite and 500 pounds of metal shrapnel and exploded.
No one's doubting that there was a serious issue there and it needed to be dealt with. The question is, how did you deal with it? Did you target the wrong people? Did you target people who had nothing to do with it?
At lunchtime, the blast killed 35 people and injured more than 400. Shattered windows for blocks and tore through the financial district. Never definitively caught, strongly suspected to be Italian anarchists, likely followers of Luigi Gallieni, who carried out similar mail bombings the previous year.
Okay.
Finally got the right to vote.
So he didn't really answer the question. He didn't really address anything other than to tell us what happened. So here, I'll read to you directly from the FBI's own website on this. The nation demanded a response to the bombings. An attorney general who had his eye on the White House in 1920 was ready to oblige. He created a small division to gather intelligence on the radical threat and placed a young Justice Department lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover in charge. Hoover collected and organized every scrap of intelligence gathered by the Bureau of Investigation, which, by the way, was created under the auspices of Napoleon Bonaparte's grandnephew, and by other agencies to identify anarchists most likely involved in violent activity. The young Bureau, meanwhile, continued to investigate those responsible for the bombings. Later that fall, the Department of Justice began arresting, under recently passed laws like the Sedition Act, which we were referring to earlier, suspected radicals and foreigners identified by Hoover's group, including well-known leaders Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. In December, with much public fanfare, a number of radicals were put on a ship dubbed the Red Ark or the Soviet Ark by the press and deported to Russia. So we started rounding up anyone who had what was seen as radical views, and therefore could have been tangentially responsible for these bombings. Because we couldn't find who actually did the bombings, the individual or the group responsible, we rounded up anybody who espoused strong views like communism or anarchism and shipped them off to Russia. At this point, though, politics, inexperience, and overreaction got the better of Attorney General Palmer and his department, which we've already established. Obviously, Woodrow Wilson can't control his cabinet, right? Hoover, with the encouragement of Palmer and the help of the Department of Labor, started planning a massive roundup of radicals. By early January 1920, the plans were ready. The department organized simultaneous raids in major cities. Any of this sound familiar? With local police called on to arrest thousands of suspected anarchists. Thousands of arrests because of some bombings, and we never got the bomber. The ensuing Palmer raids turned into a nightmare marked by poor communication, planning, and intelligence about who should be targeted and how many arrest warrants would be needed. The constitutionality of the entire operation was questioned, and Palmer and Hoover were roundly criticized for their plan and their overzealous domestic security efforts. And this is by the FBI themselves describing it this way. So, if anything, this is an organization that you would think would defend this position, and even they're saying, you know what, we kind of screwed up here. So there, I did for you what he didn't and told you what the Palmer raids were about, not just describing the bombings to you.
This is the funny thing, too. Battles elitism while he was in Princeton. And at the very beginning, you said that he was an elitist. Called him a sexist, and he's the guy who gave women the right to vote. I don't know, dude. I question whether you know what you're talking about here. Like, look, I know you're a smart guy. I just think that your ideology is blinding you here, and you're just attacking this guy because you don't like him.
Wilson was one of the most authoritarian presidents in American history, and his authoritarian president.
Authoritarian is insane, dude. This was wartime power.
Listen, even his proponents would acknowledge that Wilson was one of the more authoritarian presidents.
You are making the exact same argument Southerners make about Lincoln being a tyrant. The country is at war. You're falling into the same trap.
There's a difference between a war against a foreign power and dealing with a rebellion in your own country. And even then, Lincoln didn't do some of the stuff that Wilson did.
You just want to attack your opponent. You don't look at them objectively. You're just blinded by your bias here.
This led to future American presidents also abusing their power, often in the name of spreading democracy. So yes, while Woodrow Wilson may have reshaped America's role in the world with bold idealism, he ultimately only seemed to care about white men. And for a president in the 1900s, as opposed to 1700s, this is really, really bad. Why he's still seen as a top-tier president, to me, is just evidence that he had a big impact. But having a big impact doesn't mean being good. Why does the internet hate Woodrow Wilson? Because sometimes the internet is right.
Alright. Well, that was a stupid video. Look, like, he acknowledged some stuff that Wilson did, but that's a frustrating thing. Anytime there's something praiseworthy about Wilson, well, it was just it was just a trend of the times. Anytime there's something...
It baffles me that he isn't hearing himself here, because he's criticizing Mr. Beat for doing exactly what he did and saying, well, it was just a trend of the times.
To attack Wilson for... It's all Wilson's fault. It's entirely Wilson's fault. Wilson alone orchestrated all that. I don't know. I feel like this fella just can't get past his personal bias to make anything objective. Like, he can't look at Wilson for who Wilson actually is, and that's frustrating. But anyhow, I think I'm going to wrap this video up. Thank you all for watching. Be sure...
All right. Listen, in the end, there were some things I agreed with Monsieur Z about. I didn't beat myself over the head with a box, even though I thought about it a few times. And I think in the end, it's just important that we understand that every person presenting history to us is biased and has a worldview. I'm a Christian center-right conservative white, male, and all of those things affect how I see the world. It affects how I see presidents. It affects how I interpret the past. It affects how I interact with people. And as long as you understand that, then you can listen to what I say, and then you can make your own judgments about those things based on your own worldviews. So just presenting it all there for you to decide for yourself. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Please check out the podcasts if you get a chance on any platform where you get your podcasts. Stories of the Civil War, stories of the Great War. And if you wouldn't mind, give me a rating while you're at it on there. Based on what you think, I would appreciate that. Thanks for watching.